Hello everyone, it's Lindsay and I'm here with a Tip Tuesday for you guys. I know I've been kind of absent the last couple weeks. As you can hear, I'm still super sick. This is the third time I've tried to film this. I've got family home, dinner cooking, fans going, so it's gonna be a little rough, but we're gonna get through it. So today for Tip Tuesday, we are talking about acrylic paints. I've had a few questions about using those, and I've also kind of learned some things along the way that I think will be helpful for you guys, as far as the difference between like artist grade paints and craft paints and techniques for applying them and things like that. So let me show you some examples in my Bible where I have used them, and then we'll kind of talk about the paints and the differences. So I don't use acrylic paint very often. I prefer watercolor. Acrylic paint can be a little finicky because it is more likely to cover the text in your Bible, and I just have a harder time working with it, but I have used it a few times on my channel. Here's an example using the card swiping technique, so taking a gift card or a credit card and swiping the paint onto the background of the page, and that gives you this transparent look where you can see the text. And this is something that Shauna Noel brought to the Bible journaling community and kind of showed us for creating backgrounds on your page. Here I used it to do some lettering. I did water down the paint just a little bit so it's a little more fluid, and a small fine brush, and went in and did some lettering. And then here you see it looks similar to the card swiping technique, but I actually just used a flat tipped paintbrush and then brush on the paint, which gives you a much more opaque look. And so this will cover text if you're not careful. This here is applying paint through a stencil. For this particular one, I used some makeup sponges, which I will talk about as far as stencils. I've mentioned that in a Tip Tuesday before. And you can see acrylic paint does have a tendency to go opaque, and so some of the text is covered with this technique, but I'll show you another way that doesn't cover the text. Here, the gold and the blue in the background, it's kind of hard to see, is applied with a baby wipe. This is a technique we've seen with Elaine Davis and April from Marine Parents have shown this way, and it gives you a much more transparent and kind of a watercolor look. So it's a much softer look than using the card technique. And then here I also used acrylic paint on a transparency sheet to create a tip-in. So working on slick surfaces like this, it's kind of better to work with something like an acrylic paint that can grab a hold of a slick surface, unlike watercolor, which wouldn't give you this effect. And so you can see you get very vibrant, very strong color payoff with something like this. So I've also done stamping with acrylics. I've done acrylic florals in my planner, which I will link that video down below for you guys if you want to check that out. But for the most part, I don't use them too often, and I am not a trained artist, so my knowledge is just from my own study and playing with them. So if you are trained and smarter than me, which you probably are, leave comments down below to help any questions that might pop up or any corrections of things that I say wrong. But what I have here are a few examples of paint, and I try to pick ones that were pretty much the same color so you could kind of see how different they are. I have a Liquitex Basics acrylic paint in light portrait pink. This is a student grade acrylic paint. And then I have the Liquitex Heavy Body in light portrait pink, and this is more of an artist grade paint, and I will talk about what those differences are. Apple Barrel Cameo paint pink, and this is craft paint. And then the Handmade Modern, these are the ones from Target, and these are craft paint, and they come in more of a pot like this, whereas the other ones come more like a squeezy tube. So it just kind of depends on what you prefer for what you do. Now, as far as the differences between craft paint and artist paint, craft paints you're going to find at places like Walmart, Target, and then your big box craft stores over in the craft section of the store. And so these, I remember, if you're like from the 80s, 90s, my grandma was a toll painter, so I remember like sitting down and painting wood and painting porcelain pieces and things like that, and all of her brushes that I was not allowed to touch or she had special rules about. So that was kind of my experience with craft paints. And then when you dive into the world of artist grade, you're looking at more like on canvases and mixed media pieces, and you dive into the world of like light fastness and how light fast things are. And these are created, specifically the artist quality ones, are created with pigments that are generated in nature. And so that's reflected in the price point also. And so the difference between something like the Liquitex Basics and the Liquitex Heavy Body, the Liquitex Heavy Body is an artist grade paint, and so this has less filler in it and more pigment, and so you're getting a true color payoff. Color light fastness doesn't really apply when you're working in your Bible because it's not really exposed to much sunlight, so you don't have to worry about that. This is thicker, so if you're working on a canvas, you can get, using a palette knife, you can get lots of texture and things like that, but for Bible journaling, that's not really a concern. The Basics collection is a student grade version of this paint, and so what you'll see is the color is slightly off. So this is more of a peachy pink, and this is more of a pink. And that's because this has been filled with more fillers and are usually man-made colors as opposed to nature-made colors, and so the color isn't going to be true, but that does make it cheaper. And for what we're using it for, it's actually better. And so you can see what I did is I wrote on here using a waterproof pen and then swiped over with a card technique, so you get an idea of what it would look like over Bible text. And because this has more filler in it, it makes it more transparent, and so you can swipe over the text and still see the text coming through. Because these have less fillers, they are more opaque, depending on the pigment specifically, but they tend to be more opaque, and you can see it makes it more cloudy, and so you're more likely to actually cover the text accidentally with something like this than the student grade. With craft paints, it really varies, and it could be different between colors, different between brands, because there's a lot of filler, a lot of man-made things in these, and so it's just kind of random what you get. And so specifically with the Target ones, I know these are super popular in the Bible journaling world right now. They've kind of taken it by storm, because we all, like, who doesn't love Target and pretty colors? But I've actually found I don't prefer these paints because they're super unpredictable. I can pick up a set of 5. 3 of them will be good and 2 will be kind of crummy, a weird texture, or not good color payoff, and it's all different between the pots. I don't love having that pot style opening. I just find it a little bit harder to work with. And price wise, so these run from like $2 to $4 depending on what finish you're getting, whereas you can get craft paints from Walmart from anywhere from like 69 cents, or you can go all the way up into nicer brands like the Martha Stewart ones, which can be almost $4 a bottle. But these actually tend to be cheaper than the Target ones and are a little better consistency wise, so I prefer these, but it just kind of depends on what you prefer. With these ones, the Liquitex Heavy Body, those are the fine art, will be anywhere from $5, $6 all the way up to $20, $25 depending on the color and the pigment that it's made out of. And so that's why you'll see that variance in the price, which seems a little crazy, but it depends. If it's made out of a pigment that is super rare in nature, it's going to be higher in price, and that's why you see those differences. The Liquitex Basics are going to be consistent in price and are usually around, like, I don't know, $4 to $6, depending on where you go, and you get, quite a bit more in a tube than you do here. So I mean, these are great if you're doing canvases and fancy art pieces. That's not what I'm doing, so I won't be. I actually specifically bought this just for this video. I don't buy these paints typically. Another point I want to point out is that if you're working in your Bible, you want to stay away from glossy paints. Glossy paints and anything with a glossy finish, Mod Podge that's glossy, glues that are glossy, paints that are glossy are going to have a tendency to make your pages stick together, which you don't want. And so when Hobby Lobby had their huge sale, I got a whole bunch. I'm thinking like 15, 20 of these Bria Reese paints. They were marked down to like $1, and they were beautiful colors. They were in the fine art section, and so I was super excited, and they dry with a glossy finish. So I can't really use these in my Bible. I'll have to find another project for them. So just be aware. And it doesn't say on here whether it's matte or glossy, but if you stick with the cheaper craft paints, they're almost always matte unless they indicate that they are a gloss or shimmer. So you want to look for matte or satin, and that's going to keep you safe in your Bible. And so let's talk about the different ways to apply them. So like I said, Shauna Noel showed the card swiping technique. So you'll just use, she has these paint cards that you can purchase, or you can use an old gift card or credit card, something like that. And that's where it's nice to have these squeezy tubes, because you can just squeeze a teeny tiny amount of paint onto the, oops, that's way more than you need, onto the edge of the card. And then holding at a 45-degree angle, you're just going to pull it down the page. And I actually had way too much paint on there, and so it's going to be going forever. But doing that technique there, you can get it pretty transparent where you can see the text. And the other nice thing about that technique is it dries super, super quick. And so you can go back in with other colors and layer over and not have to worry about, you know, fussing with wet paint. It dries super fast. Another way to use them is with a baby wipe. And so just taking, you know, any kind of baby wipe, you can work from the pot with this kind. If you're wanting to do the card swiping technique with the pot style paints like this, you can just pick up a little bit of paint with a paintbrush and then wipe it on the tip of the card, and that's how you can get away with doing that same technique with those. But you just want a teeny tiny little bit of paint on a baby wipe, and then you're just going to swipe it on your page, and you can see you get a much softer, almost watercolor look with a baby wipe. And then you can also use that technique through a stencil. And so taking just a little bit of paint, I'm going to dab off a little bit of the extra, and then with kind of a pouncing motion, you can go through the stencil. And this is a way that you can get that transparent look and not worry about covering the text, is if you're using the baby wipe, because it really brings down the opacity of that paint. Another way to do through a stencil is with these cosmetic sponges. And I do believe I showed this in another Tip Tuesday all about stencils. So you can check that out. I'll link it down below. I like to pick up a little bit of paint on one of these sponges and then pounce off 90% of the paint. There's hardly any paint on this sponge. And then go through the stencil with that pouncing motion, and you can see it's more opaque than it is with baby wipe, and but it's dry, and so don't have to worry about it seeping underneath the stencil. If you go in with a paintbrush and just glob that paint on, it's going to run underneath the stencil and you're going to have problems. So if you apply it with this, it's a little bit better way to do it. You can also stamp with acrylic paints. I think I had a Tip Tuesday or past videos showing how to do this also. So I'm just going to take one of the alphabet stamps, and same thing, it's best to apply this with one of the sponges. And so I'm going to dab off quite a bit of paint and then sponge that on. I'm barely tapping the stamp, just getting even coverage, and then I can go ahead and stamp that down. You can also use a flat-ended paintbrush and pick up paint and apply it that way. You're just gonna have more of a kind of mixed media look, because it's gonna be more globby. You're gonna have your paint strokes or your paintbrush strokes and things like that. It's not gonna be quite as even and solid as it is with the makeup sponge. So that's kind of my preferred way. You do want to use a baby wipe or soap and water to wash off your stamp really well and not let that acrylic paint dry on your stamp. But this would be great for texture stamps and some of those solid, like the triangles and the hexagons and different shapes like that, is to stamp with it. Let's see, another way is kind of like watercolor. So let's say you have tons and tons of craft paints. Maybe you've been crafting for a long time, and then you're new to the Bible journaling world or whatever, and you have a lot of craft paints, but you don't have a lot of watercolors, and you want to kind of explore with that. You can get a similar effect by adding some water to your acrylic paints. You don't want to do this if you're going to be painting on a piece, like on a canvas or something like that, because the water does break down the paint and may cause it to flake off of something like a canvas. But for in your Bible, it's fine. So I'm just adding some water. You could use one of the water brushes, like one of these that has water in the barrel already. And I'm just mixing it until it's the transparency that I want. And then you can go in and paint with it. It is going to behave a little bit differently than watercolor because it's a heavier like pigment concentration than watercolor. And then once this dries, you can't really pick up that color again. So you could go over and layer color over it. So that is one way. It does seem to dry with kind of a chalky looking finish, but it's not chalky from what I have found. So that is one way. Like I have tons and tons of craft paint colors that I could explore with this technique. You just want to make sure it's watered down enough that it doesn't cover your text. If you have, some of the cheaper paints have a tendency to dry super quickly. So if you've got certain paints that seem to be drying faster than you have time to work with them, you can add something like matte gel medium. This is technically a glue, but it's also an extender. So you can add just a little bit of this, mix it in with your craft paint. On a palette, I wouldn't mix it into the bottle. So squirt out a little bit of paint and mix it with this. And this is gonna make it so that paint doesn't dry quite as fast. So if you're wanting some time to work with it and move it and manipulate it without it drying super, super fast, mix it with a little bit of this. This does thin it out a little bit and increases the transparency because it's diluting the pigment, but not too bad. It's kind of meant for that. So you can add that to it if you've got paints that are cheaper and you're having some issues with. Another technique for applying is with bubble wrap. This came from April, Marine Parents. She kind of brought us this technique here. And so you can just pick up some paint. This is where it's nice to have the pot style because I can work out of like the lid and not have to put it on a palette. And I probably should have used a bigger brush, but that's okay. So you're just gonna brush a little bit of paint onto your bubble wrap packaging, and then you can stamp it and get some fun textures. And so I have not explored with jelly plate printing. I know there's been some tutorials on Illustrated Faith and things like that. That is something I do want to try out, and you can use paints for that. If you are finding that your paints, the craft paints, are drying super fast, like I said, add in that matte gel medium, and you can explore with some mixed media stuff like that. So there's some different ways to use these. If you have questions, be sure to leave those down below. I do want to say that you want to have separate brushes. So I have a set of brushes, or I try to. I'm not always good about it, but the brushes that you use for your acrylic paints, you don't want to use with your watercolor paints. The acrylics are kind of hard on your brushes, and so you're not gonna have as nice of a time with your watercolors if you use a brush that's been used with acrylics, because it does affect your brushes. And you do want to be careful that you don't get the paint up into this portion, the metal portion or plastic portion of your paintbrush, and you want to rinse them out right away. Don't let them sit in water and that kind of thing. Those are all no-nos my grandma taught me. So you do want the paint just to stay in the brushes, and make sure that you clean them really well right away, and then that way you don't have problems with the paint drying in your brushes. So if you have questions or more tips or comments, be sure to leave those down below. Subscribe to my channel if you're not already subscribed, and give this video a thumbs up if it was helpful. And until next time, thank you so much. Bye-bye.